The sun rose over the rugged plains near the Yarmouk River, casting a golden haze over the landscape that would soon become the stage for one of the bloodiest confrontations of the early Islamic conquests. The air was tense with anticipation, carrying the scent of dust and the quiet murmurs of armies preparing for a battle that would echo through the centuries. On one side, the Byzantine Empire, ancient and imposing, commanded by generals seasoned in the art of war, veterans of countless campaigns that had once expanded Rome's reach from the sands of Arabia to the forests of Gaul. Their armor gleamed under the morning sun, shields etched with symbols of an empire that had endured the rise and fall of dynasties, yet now faced a new threat. A force emerging from the deserts of Arabia, disciplined, fervent, and driven by a conviction that seemed almost otherworldly. The Arab army, under the strategic guidance of Khalid ibn al-Walid, known as the Sword of Allah, had traversed the harsh deserts with a determination that defied the elements. They carried not only weapons, but a vision of transformation, a vision rooted in faith and unity. These warriors were a blend of agility and tenacity, their camels and horses moving with the rhythm of the desert winds. They were far from a faceless horde. Each soldier bore the weight of loyalty to his commander and the promise of a cause that transcended mere survival. They had already demonstrated their capacity for strategy and endurance, conquering towns and fortresses with a swiftness that left empires reeling. Yet facing the Byzantines at Yarmouk would test not only their skill, but the very limits of their resolve. The stage was set across the undulating terrain, where hills and ravines carved a natural amphitheater for the impending clash. Scouts and cavalry units moved like shadows, reporting every movement, every whispered intention of the opposing forces. The Byzantines relied on their tried-and-true formations, walls of infantry bristling with spears, cavalry ready to charge with thunderous momentum, archers poised to rain death from a distance. They had faced many enemies in their time, yet there was something unfamiliar about this army from the south. A unity that defied conventional understanding, a combination of swift mobility and relentless courage that could not easily be countered by brute strength alone. Their discipline was almost hypnotic, every man moving as though he were part of a larger living organism. Khalid, ever vigilant, observed the Byzantines with a calculated patience. He understood that victory would not come from brute force alone, but from the precise orchestration of his troops, exploiting every weakness, every hesitation in the enemy lines. He divided his forces into strategic wings, each designed to respond to the fluidity of battle. This was more than a fight. It was a carefully composed dance of strategy and instinct, where the desert-born warriors would face the might of Rome on a terrain that demanded cunning and audacity. In the stillness before the storm, there was an almost sacred tension, a recognition that the outcome of this battle would alter the course of history in a region caught between empires and faiths. The first movements were subtle, almost imperceptible. Cavalry scouts tested the Byzantine flanks, feints that probed for weakness. The Byzantines, confident in their experience and superior numbers, responded with rigidity, failing to anticipate the flexibility and adaptability of Khalid's command. As the sun climbed higher, the desert air shimmered with heat and anticipation, and the clash became inevitable. When the first volleys of arrows split the morning air, followed by the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel, the battlefield erupted into chaos. Yet beneath the tumult, every movement reflected the interplay of strategy, courage, and the inexorable momentum of history. The air trembled with the sound of war as the armies collided, a living tempest of steel and fury. The Byzantines advanced with disciplined precision, their shields forming an unbroken wall, their spears stabbing forward like the teeth of some colossal predator. From the center of their formation, the generals barked commands, trying to impose order on the chaos that was already beginning to consume them. Yet the Arab forces, moving with a swiftness born of desert survival and unshakable conviction, did not merely meet the Byzantines head-on. They flowed around them, striking at the flanks, retreating and returning in unpredictable waves that tested the patience and coordination of even the most seasoned commanders. Khalid ibn al-Walid rode along the lines, his presence a beacon of resolve for his men. He was not just a commander but a master of perception, reading the battlefield like a chessboard of shifting shadows and movements. Here, a cluster of Byzantine archers hesitated. There, a cavalry unit overextended in their eagerness to flank. With a single signal, Khalid directed his troops, turning potential chaos into orchestrated precision. His warriors moved like extensions of his will, striking in surges, retreating to draw the enemy forward, then cutting them off with devastating efficiency. The desert-born soldiers had learned the art of patience and ambush, and now they applied it on a scale that would test the limits of the Byzantine army. The clash was relentless. Spears shattered against shields. Swords carved arcs of blood through the air, and the cries of men mingled with the neighing of horses and the clash of metal. Dust and heat swirled into a haze that turned the battlefield into a place where the senses were overwhelmed, where every step could be the difference between survival and death. Amid the chaos, individual acts of bravery emerged. A Byzantine centurion rallying his men despite a growing sense of encirclement. An Arab cavalryman charging through the heart of the enemy line to protect a faltering unit, both unaware that their fates were intertwined in the inexorable flow of the battle. As the day progressed, the tide began to shift. The Byzantines, despite their superior numbers, struggled to adapt to the fluid tactics of the Arab forces. Khalid had studied their weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. He had anticipated their reliance on rigid formations, their dependence on brute force rather than flexibility, and he had crafted a battle that played to these vulnerabilities. Feigned retreats drew the Byzantines into traps, hidden reserves cut off retreat paths, and the desert warriors struck with a precision that belied their outward simplicity. The blood spilled on the plains was not just the cost of combat, it was the ink of history, writing a story that would resonate through generations. Yet even as victory seemed within reach, the battle was far from decided. The Byzantines, cornered and desperate, unleashed their reserves, fresh troops who struck with renewed vigor, forcing the Arabs into defensive maneuvers. The ground became a churned wasteland of mud, blood, and broken weapons. Each step a perilous gamble. Khalid responded with rapid redeployments, shifting his forces like pieces on a board, refusing to allow the Byzantines any measure of stability. His genius lay not in the size of his army, but in the orchestration of movement, in the ability to turn apparent weakness into strength, chaos into controlled aggression. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the battlefield, both armies bore the marks of the ferocity they had endured. The sound of combat gradually melded into a tense, eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant cries of the wounded. Yet beneath this fragile calm, the currents of history were already being rewritten. The Arab forces had proven that their vision, their faith, and their discipline could challenge even the might of an empire. And though the battle raged on, the first glimmers of a decisive momentum were visible, a momentum that would soon tip the scales irreversibly. As the afternoon wore on, the battle reached a fevered pitch. The plains of Yarmouk were scarred with trenches of blood, scattered weapons, and fallen men whose lives had become part of the relentless tide of history. The Byzantines, once confident in their superior numbers and seasoned formations, began to falter under the relentless pressure of Khalid's maneuvers. Every charge they made was met with a counterstrike. Every attempted flank became a trap. The Arab army, like a living storm, twisted and shifted with an almost mystical precision, striking where the enemy least expected it and vanishing before the Byzantines could retaliate. It was a battle not just of strength but of cunning, a clash of civilizations with consequences that would echo across the centuries. Khalid had positioned his forces to exploit the natural terrain, using ridges, gullies, and the riverbanks to mask movements and conceal reserves. He waited for the perfect moment to execute the decisive encirclement, the maneuver that would seal the fate of the Byzantine army. Signals were given, banners waved, horns sounded, and slowly, inexorably, the Byzantine lines found themselves compressed, stretched, and finally enveloped. The shock was instantaneous. Soldiers who had once felt invincible now faced the terrifying reality of being trapped, unable to retreat or regroup. Panic began to ripple through their ranks, a silent contagion that spread faster than any arrow could fly. In the heart of the chaos, individual acts of heroism still shone like sparks in a storm. A Byzantine officer rallied a handful of men to resist the encroaching tide, cutting through the Arab cavalry with furious desperation. Yet even these bursts of courage were unable to stem the tide. Khalid's strategy was flawless, his understanding of human psychology as sharp as his mastery of tactics. He knew that morale could crumble faster than swords could pierce armor, and he wielded this knowledge like a blade, striking both physically and mentally. The Byzantines found themselves fighting not just an enemy, but the inevitability of their own unraveling. As the sun sank toward the horizon, the battlefield transformed into a theater of annihilation. The Arabs pressed the encirclement, closing the noose around the Byzantine forces. The clash of steel rang louder, the cries of the dying and wounded rising like a dreadful symphony. Horses stumbled over the bodies of men, shields were splintered, and formations disintegrated under the relentless assault. The Byzantine generals attempted to organize counterattacks, desperate to restore order, but each effort was anticipated and countered. Khalid's forces moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed play, each unit executing its role with deadly accuracy. What had begun as a massive confrontation of two armies had become a masterclass in strategy and endurance, a vivid illustration of how leadership, faith, and flexibility could overcome sheer numerical might. By twilight, the battlefield was a sea of exhausted men, bloodied yet unbroken in spirit. The Arab forces, though wearied by the day's ferocity, remained disciplined, their cohesion intact. They had turned the tide, not through brute force alone, but through relentless adaptability and the psychological unraveling of their opponents. The Byzantines, once the pride of an empire that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, were now teetering on the edge of collapse. Their wings had been broken, their center compressed, and their morale shattered. Khalid had orchestrated more than a victory. He had demonstrated a fundamental truth of warfare, that the mind and the will could triumph where numbers alone could not. As night descended, the echoes of battle lingered like a ghost over the plains. Fires burned, the cries of survivors mingled with the groans of the wounded, and the fallen lay silent beneath a sky now streaked with the colors of dusk. It was a pause, but not an end. The Arabs had proven their mastery, but the full consequences of this day were yet to be realized. In the hearts of both victors and vanquished, the memory of Yarmouk would be seared forever, a testament to courage, strategy, and the inexorable flow of history. The stage was set for the aftermath, for the reckoning that would reshape empires and alter the course of a region caught between faith, ambition, and the tides of war. As the first light of dawn touched the scarred plains of Yarmouk, the battlefield told a story that words could scarcely contain. Bodies of men and horses lay strewn across the ground, armor dented and bloodied, weapons shattered, a silent testament to the violence that had raged through the day. The Arab forces moved among the fallen, tending to the wounded, regrouping, and ensuring that order followed chaos. Khalid ibn al-Walid, his armor streaked with dust and sweat, surveyed the scene with a measured gaze. Victory had been claimed not only through courage, but through the mastery of strategy, foresight, and unshakable resolve. The Byzantines, once confident in the might of their empire, had been humbled, their army fractured and dispersed. their dream of defending Syria against the advancing Arabs irrevocably broken. The aftermath was both brutal and transformative. Survivors of the Byzantine army retreated in disarray, abandoning supplies, weapons, and even the wounded to the victors. Villages and cities that had looked to the Byzantines for protection now faced a new reality, a shifting balance of power that would alter loyalties and reshape the political landscape. The Arab conquest, already swift and determined, gained a momentum that seemed unstoppable. News of the victory at Yarmouk spread quickly, its impact rippling across the region like wildfire, inspiring those who had yet to join the rising caliphate and demoralizing those who still clung to the vestiges of Byzantine rule. Amid the human tragedy, there was also a sense of mythic grandeur. Soldiers on both sides understood that they had participated in an event that would endure far beyond the lifespan of any individual. The Arabs had not merely won a battle, they had demonstrated the potency of unity, faith, and ingenuity against an empire that had long appeared invincible. Stories would be told of the courage displayed on the field, of the leadership that turned apparent weakness into triumph, and of the determination that allowed a smaller, more flexible force to overcome a larger, heavily armed opponent. In these stories, history and legend intertwined, as the deeds of men became inseparable from the shaping of civilizations. Khalid's leadership became the stuff of legend almost immediately. Known as the Sword of Allah, his tactics at Yarmouk would be studied by generations of generals, revered not only for their brilliance, but for their timing, adaptability, and psychological insight. He had understood that battles are won as much in the minds of men as on the ground, and he had exploited every hesitation, every doubt within the Byzantine ranks. Yet Khalid's genius was not merely in intellect. It was in his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty and courage. His men fought not simply as soldiers, but as participants in a larger destiny, bound together by faith, purpose, and the certainty that they were part of a transformative moment in history. For the Byzantine Empire, Yarmouk was a catastrophe of monumental scale. It marked the beginning of the end for Byzantine dominion over the Levant and signaled the rise of a new power in the region. Political consequences unfolded as quickly as the army's retreat. Cities once under imperial protection reconsidered allegiances, fortresses fell with minimal resistance, and the very notion of Byzantine invincibility was shattered. The empire, already strained by internal conflicts and external pressures, was forced to reckon with a changing world where faith, strategy, and adaptability could overturn centuries of tradition and conquest. Yet even amid the triumph, the Arab forces understood the cost of victory. Thousands of men lay dead, the ground soaked with blood, and every step of their advance would be haunted by the memories of comrades lost. The battle was a reminder that history is forged not in comfort, but in fire. Not in ease, but through trials that test the limits of endurance and courage. It was a lesson carried forward as the Arab armies continued their campaigns, expanding the caliphate, reshaping the Middle East, and leaving a legacy that would endure for centuries. Yarmouk was not simply a battle, it was the threshold between eras, a turning point that redefined the balance of power, faith, and civilization itself. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the scars of battle, the silence that followed carried with it a reflection both somber and profound. Empires can crumble, armies can be defeated, yet the human spirit, driven by vision, faith, and strategy, remains capable of shaping the course of history. The plains of Yarmouk would remain a symbol, a place where destiny had been contested and decided, where the courage of men and the brilliance of command had rewritten the fate of nations. And in that silence, one could almost hear the echo of generations to come, remembering the blood, the valor, and the inexorable force of history that had converged on this single, unforgettable day. The echoes of Yarmouk did not fade with the setting sun. They reverberated across the Levant and beyond, carrying a message that empires could no longer ignore. The Arab forces, emboldened by their triumph, capitalized on the disarray of the Byzantine territories. Cities that had once stood as bulwarks of imperial authority now opened their gates to the conquerors, recognizing that resistance was futile against the momentum unleashed by Khalid and his army. The conquest of Syria accelerated, fortress by fortress, town by town, falling not simply to force, but to the combination of strategic calculation and psychological dominance that had been perfected on the plains of Yarmouk. The ripple effects were immediate and profound, altering not only political boundaries but the very fabric of society in the region. The victory at Yarmouk also marked a turning point in military history. The Arabs had demonstrated that a smaller, highly mobile and ideologically united force could challenge and defeat a sprawling empire with centuries of military experience. Their tactics, rapid maneuvers, feigned retreats, encirclement and psychological warfare became case studies in the art of war, showing that discipline and innovation could outweigh numerical superiority. Commanders across the known world would study Khalid's maneuvers, seeking to understand the genius that had allowed a desert-born army to rout one of the most formidable military machines of the age. It was a lesson etched in blood, dust, and the enduring memory of men who had fought and died on that field. Beyond the immediate military and political consequences, Yarmouk reshaped the cultural and religious landscape of the region. The Arab victory facilitated the spread of Islam across Syria and the Levant, intertwining the destiny of faith with the rhythm of conquest. Byzantine influence, though not erased entirely, receded, giving way to new centers of administration, scholarship, and commerce that would define the early caliphate. Trade routes, once controlled by the Byzantines, fell under new stewardship, and the integration of conquered peoples into the expanding caliphate accelerated. Yarmouk was more than a battle. It was a threshold between two worlds, a moment when the course of civilizations shifted, leaving behind echoes that would resonate through architecture, language, law, and belief for generations to come. Yet even as the Arab forces advanced, they faced the challenges of governance, consolidation, and integration. Victory on the battlefield was only the first step. Securing lasting control required diplomacy, patience, and the careful management of newly subjugated populations. Khalid, ever the strategist, understood this well. His campaigns were guided not only by the principles of war, but by an awareness of the political and social complexities that would define lasting rule. Treaties were negotiated, cities administered, and the structures of governance adapted to the new reality. The Arab triumph at Yarmouk thus became a blueprint for sustainable conquest, demonstrating that true power lay not solely in the sword, but in the capacity to govern, inspire, and transform. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, was forced into a period of reflection and recovery. Yarmouk had exposed vulnerabilities long overlooked, weaknesses in coordination, flexibility, and understanding of emerging threats. Efforts to stabilize the eastern provinces were urgent but limited in effectiveness, hampered by internal dissent, logistical challenges, and the psychological blow of having suffered defeat at the hands of what had once seemed an inferior force. The empire would endure, yes, but its aura of invincibility had been irrevocably tarnished. The memory of Yarmouk lingered, a specter haunting generals, bureaucrats, and emperors alike, a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations were susceptible to change, upheaval, and the unrelenting tide of history. In the decades that followed, the legacy of Yarmouk would continue to shape the Middle East. The Arab conquests spread beyond Syria, carrying the cultural, religious, and political influence of the emerging caliphate into Mesopotamia, Persia, and beyond. The principles demonstrated on that battlefield, the fusion of strategy, faith, and adaptability, became hallmarks of a military tradition that would endure for centuries. Generations would tell of the sword of Allah, of the plains where empires clashed, of the men who fought not only for territory, but for destiny itself. Yarmouk became a symbol, a story told in blood and legend, an enduring testament to the power of vision and leadership to transform the course of human events. Even now, as historians, storytellers and scholars look back across the centuries, the lessons of Yarmouk remain vivid. The battlefield, once alive with chaos and fury, now exists in memory, in records, in the stories passed down through generations. It is a place where history was forged, where the balance of power shifted, and where the courage, ingenuity, and resolve of men and armies shaped the fate of nations. The bloodiest day of the early Islamic conquests was not merely a military victory. It was a defining moment in the story of civilizations, a collision of empires that left an indelible mark on the human imagination, inviting all who study it to witness the relentless, transformative force of history itself.